Today's show is sponsored by How to Fix the Internet, an original podcast from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Sometimes it can feel like we are moving towards a digital future no one wants, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are choices we can make to create an internet that makes a better future for all of us. In each episode, Cindy Cohn and Jason Kelly invite someone with a vision on how to fix the internet, someone with real solutions on how to move the needle forward towards a better online world. We checked out the Freedom to Tinker episode of How to Fix the Internet, and it was interesting to see how we can learn from open source and lessons from the past to fix future challenges. Search for How to Fix the Internet in your podcast player, and we'll include a link in the show notes. Our thanks to How to Fix the Internet for their support.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is Aaron for Cloud News this week. And I admit, I've been a little behind here lately. Listeners may or may not have known I had a big birthday and went on a big ski trip out to Park City, Utah, and had a fantastic time. But I admit, it has been a struggle to catch back up. But here we are. It is Cloud News for this week, and then we also have a great talk about cloud native security coming up after the break. And so for our first news article, the Kubernetes project, there's a community-owned image registry that was out there, k8s.gcr.io, and it was announced a couple months ago that this will be frozen and everything will be migrated over to registry.k8s.io. Now, some reasons were given on this one, and there was a blog about it. Basically, at the end of the day, things are going to be a little bit faster. Everything's going to be load balanced instead of just being hosted on the Google Container Registry, that's GCR. It will be co-hosted between Google and AWS as well. So a little bit of load balancing going on, a little bit of adding some features to all of this and making things better for the future. But to those that are out there that are interested in this, the old registry is going away. And when I say going away, I mean it's going to be frozen. And as of the 3rd of April, no more changes will be made to that. So definitely, if this is something that will impact you, it's something you'd want to look into as soon as possible. And moving on to our second article, and this goes back to ChatGPT, and it's been all over the news. And Google did their big Bard announcement, and that was less than spectacular, shall we say. Well, Microsoft now, with their Bing chat and search functionality being integrated with ChatGPT, it's a little rough around the edges as well. And so what they're finding out is the more questions you ask it, it kind of goes down this weird rabbit hole where it starts to make less and less sense. So Microsoft is going to be limiting Bing chats to 5 questions per session, and that's it. And hopefully that will stop a little bit of the madness, if you will, in the ChatGPT world. Always interesting to watch this develop, and it's also interesting to see all of the press around something like this. Some of it positive, some of it not so much, but it's always interesting to watch these things develop. And third thing for our news is VMware on Broadcom acquisition, back in the news. But this one, honestly, it's not that big of a deal probably, but it's also worth talking about is the merger talks are going to be extended. So they've extended it 90 days, and they're expecting this now to close somewhere in the May timeframe. But they do admit the EU regulators in particular are still looking at everything and may not have an answer until sometime in June. So we may even see another delay again. Again, an acquisition of this big, it's going to get some scrutiny. It's going to get the regulators looking at it, and it's going to go through the approval process, and that's going to take time. With that, quick reminder, all of these links are in our Cloud News links and document, but there's also some others in there as well. I've started to just kind of I talk about the top 3, but I've thrown some other ones in there. There's What is a Bridge Round, which I thought was really fascinating considering the state of the VC industry. It really explains bridge rounds really well. And then there's another one that comes from the API newsletter that we've talked about many times on the show before, but WTF is an API product manager and product management of APIs, which also I thought was a super fascinating read. So with that, I'm going to close out cloud news this week. Coming up after the break, we have Michael Isbitski over at Sysdig talking about cloud native security.
Today's episode of the Cloudcast is sponsored by Datadog, a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, traces, and logs into one tightly integrated platform. Datadog APM empowers developer teams to identify anomalies, resolve issues, and improve application performance. Begin collecting stack traces, visualizing them as flame graphs, organizing them into profile types such as CPU, I/O, and more. Teams can search for specific profiles, correlate them with distributed traces, and identify slow or underperforming code for analysis and optimization. Plus, with Datadog APM Live Search, you can perform searches across the full stream of ingested traces generated by your application over the last 15 minutes. Try Datadog APM free with a 14-day trial, and Datadog will send you a free t-shirt. Visit datadog.com/APM-Cloudcast to get started. That's datadog.com/APM-Cloudcast.
Are you struggling to keep up with the demands of managing and securing identity in your distributed enterprise IT environment? You're not alone, but don't let it hold you back. With Strata's identity orchestration platform, you can secure all your apps on any cloud with any IDP, so your IT teams will never have to refactor for identity again. Imagine modernizing app identity in minutes instead of months, deploying passwordless on any tricky old app, and achieving business resilience with always-on identity, all from one lightweight and flexible platform. Want to see it in action? Share your identity challenge with us on a discovery call, and we'll hook you up with a complimentary pair of AirPods Pro. Don't miss out. Visit strata.io/cloudcast. That's strata.io/cloudcast.
And we're back. And folks, we're into 2023. 2023 obviously has some new dynamics to the year as we haven't had over the last couple of years. And one of the big things that is a very, very early talking point for the year is, people getting back to being very, very focused around security. Sometimes when the economy makes some ups and downs, we start to kind of go back and say, hey, let's look at, what we're doing around security. Are we doing all the best practices? What's our hygiene looks like? Are we focused enough on it? And obviously we just finished having the Cloud Native Security Summit out on the West Coast. And so very, very excited today to sort of dig into security a little more and to really dig into not just theory, not just, what's out there, but really dig into a bunch of data. So really, really excited to have Michael Isbitski, who is Director of Cybersecurity Strategy at Sysdig. Michael, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
It's great to be here, Brian. Thank you.
So we're going to dive into and really talk about Sysdig runs a fantastic survey and report that comes out every year, the Cloud Native Security and Usage Report. But before we dive into that, give us a little bit of your background, kind of, where you've been, maybe prior to Sysdig, your focus around security, all those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's sometimes struggle on where to start. It's been a pretty storied career, but generally I do start that I was a practitioner for quite some time, close to 20 years at Verizon. So I saw quite a bit. Primarily in the realm of enterprise architecture, but then the latter part of my career there, I was very focused on application security. So assessing all of the web applications everybody uses and mobile apps, finding quite a few interesting things. I was leading a team there as well for quite a bit. And then I jumped to the research side of things with Gartner, doing that for roughly 5 years, and saw quite a bit more. So yeah, it's quite interesting path. And then I pivoted, and then kind of more in the realm of evangelism and just raising public awareness around all types of security issues. Certainly still keeping my pulse on the application security, but also very focused on cloud and container security as well, which is how I landed at Sysdig.
Yeah, no, that's great. We've covered Sysdig for a long time. A number of friends over there, and Pop and others. And but for folks that maybe aren't familiar with Sysdig, maybe they're new to the cloud native space, maybe they've been doing more traditional security. Just give us a quick overview of Sysdig, the technology, sort of the philosophy around both open source and the commercial offerings and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's I got to be careful because one, I'm not great at the sales pitch, but two, it can also be quite lengthy. But I'd say the most succinct explanation is we help with cloud security from source to run. Sysdig has a very deep and mature pedigree with containers and Kubernetes specifically. And some of your listeners might be familiar with a tool like Wireshark. It's very commonly used in the network engineering and network security space, but even sometimes application troubleshooting. So one of our co-founders, Loris Dejani, brought a lot of those design philosophies to Sysdig. And that's actually open sourced as Sysdig open source. And it gathers syscall data, basically all of the telemetry coming off a host, including containers. And that allows you to do a lot of troubleshooting, obviously, but all of those signals also do feed into the other piece of open source software that Sysdig has, which is Falco. It's been kind of donated to CNCF. And those are kind of underpinnings of the Sysdig secure platform that Sysdig maintains. So it's a lot of capabilities there. It's kind of helps you secure all types of compute in all types of environments, right? Because most organizations have a mixture, right? Not everybody's in AWS. They might still have some things on premises, whether that's bare metal or virtual machines, but they're also doing quite a few things in containers and Kubernetes, even if it's just experimental, but they often enter the picture very quickly.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, Sysdig has been, right there at the forefront of all the cloud native stuff, going back to kind of the original Kubernetes stuff. And it's been really interesting to see, again, the evolution of not only the technology, but the contributions back to the CNCF and to open source and all those sort of things. One of the things that we love to do on this show is, obviously we get a chance to talk about a lot of trends. And a lot of times the trends are set by, headlines or an announcement or an acquisition. But we always feel like sort of the best way to dig into trends is to have a chance to dig into data. And you guys do a really good job every year of, digging into the data that you've got visibility to, which is obviously, very widespread, lots of different types of companies, lots of different types of industries. Let's talk a little bit about this cloud native security and usage report. Let's start with the scope of it. How do you guys go about collecting data? What are some of the things that you're trying to do in capturing the report and kind of representing the bigger picture?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brian, and it's I'd say it starts a lot earlier than most people would expect. I want to say we started thinking about what kind of areas of data we'd want to explore. One of my colleagues, Anna Bellick, kind of seeded a lot of those thoughts and led that. She helped quite a bit with last year's report, but it kind of starts there. And it was kind of like early summer 2022. We're like, all right, what do we explore in last year's report? What do we kind of want to dive further on? But not necessarily knowing where that story is going to take us, just knowing that these are the trends we're seeing in industry. This is where we think things might be heading. Can we get some data around that? Is it going to be interesting? We don't know, right? It's kind of educated guess, right? But also we want to eventually unearth the data that might support that or dispute it, right? That certainly happens as well. And we might talk about that as we get through the trends in the report. But yeah, it starts very much that way, right? Kind of what are the things we're seeing in industry? And then we just kind of harvest data around that's in Sysdig Secure. It is a SaaS platform. I didn't actually mention that earlier. That's how a lot of customers consume it. So we have a lot of data that is anonymized, and we can kind of pull in some really interesting stats that support these trends. So it's kind of data first. It is not survey. It is real world data, right, on billions of containers. So this is how organizations of all sizes and across industries are operating all types of environments. So we get a really realistic picture of what is the world like with cloud native security. Yeah. And then once we've gathered the data, I think the report first draft I want to say it was like 60 to 80 pages. I mean, it was pretty crazy. And then it's kind of, all right, well, what's the story we want to tell, right? So we can make this data more palatable to an audience. And the data is still there. Some of that's kind of in supplementary sections, but yeah, what are those trends? Like, what are those things that people can latch onto to drive their security programs in the year ahead?
Yeah. What are some of the trends that you guys saw maybe that have changed over the last year, or that accelerated or decelerated, that maybe were a little surprising, or maybe wasn't what you necessarily expected? What are the things that people are going to look at and go, okay, I need to dig into this a little bit more. Maybe it's relevant to their organization, or
there's quite a few. It's surprising to me also, and like I said, I've seen quite a bit in my career. But so vulnerability. I mean, if you read a security report, you often hear vulnerabilities are trending up, right? We hear that quite often. But it was interesting to see, right? And you have to kind of go into this with the mindset that these are customers that have actually deployed cloud and container security tooling, right? They're using Sysdig Secure. So they're kind of aware of the problem, and now they're seeking visibility, they're scanning, they're securing things in runtime, all that great stuff. So it's kind of like its best case, right? Or like this could be the most ideal security scenario. But one of the things that was most surprising was to see container image vulnerabilities trend up as much as they did. And I believe it was 87% in the most recent, but it trended up from 70s last year. So quite a bit of latent vulnerabilities in container images that organizations, they will often spin those up in their environments. So application workloads, infrastructure, all of those things kind of become part of the running production environment. And if you go deep enough down the rabbit hole, you start kind of exploring software supply chain issues, right? Because this is container images are kind of one of those fundamental building blocks of how everybody is building not just applications, but their systems, right? Because infrastructure is also part of the equation now by virtue of DevOps. To see that trend up was very interesting, right? Because it's like, all right, we're facing a bigger problem. We're aware of it. So there's another kind of buried question there about, well, why are images getting so bad kind of in the public domain? Are public registries not doing enough to scan things? Are they inundated? And sometimes my mind goes to kind of the mobile security space because of some of my background, but also research. But you saw this a lot and still see this with public mobile app stores like Apple and Google Play, where there's just so many apps that get published, and those entities do everything they can to scan, and they're cherry picking to manually test, and they actually offload scans as well to third parties. But there's just so much code and application code, right? And these apps that they just can't scan at all effectively. So it's like you're always kind of, I don't want to say cesspool, but it's like it's not as clean or hygienic as you might like, right? So it should raise a lot of red flags for organizations about how they source componentry. But yeah, that one was pretty interesting to see trend up as much as it did. I would have expected that to go down a little, right? Because there was so much visibility on vulnerabilities, with OpenSSL, Log4j. Like there was just a lot of kind of spotlight on vulnerabilities in software in the past couple of years. Yeah, no, that was one of the ones that really jumped out at me as well. And it's one of those ones that, on one hand, we've been telling people for years and years, things like Docker Hub and public repositories are great for, being, allowing you to build that sort of hello world application quickly, kind of get something up and running. But that's never been a best practice for that to be your source of truth. It's never been a best practice for it to, sort of trust what comes from the internet. It's so there's a part of that, it's a little frustrating that, the best practices, the good practices, maybe aren't necessarily getting adopted as quickly as they could. And then on the flip side, there's always the sort of reality of security, which is, look, dude, sometimes security is, especially in times when there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of people pushing, hey, we need new. Sometimes security is sometimes a secondary thought. And, the last few years have been boom years. Sometimes this is a wake up call. So,
as much as you might look at that as, okay, the numbers went up, maybe that's a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing. A red flag like that can be a good thing to get people going. Okay, I didn't know we were as vulnerable or as potentially exposed as we could have been. And again, part of it is tooling, like you said. Are the things scanning things the right way? But part of it is just building the right mindset into your sort of cultural DNA and the way you do stuff. So, on the flip side of that, what are some of the other things you've seen in terms of, because this report is not only sort of security, but it's also about usage, kind of growth and usage. Yeah. What are some of the usage trends that are sort of surprising to you?
Yeah, and that was another very kind of surprising statistic, and one of them bridges that world of security vulnerabilities. We talk about this concept of in-use and in-use risk exposure, but there's kind of this reality of what happens when you source third-party libraries and componentry. You're not always using all the functionality in that, and you might actually reference a library that just maybe used at one point, and then you're not using that functionality because maybe you coded your own routines. It's kind of a fuzzy picture, but generally what happens is there's a lot of code that gets referenced that never actually gets used in runtime. So Sysdig has a capability to surface that and tell you, right, like, well, you might have scanned all of your images and now you know what's all the packages that are referenced. Some of those are maybe vulnerable, yes. But what are you actually seeing in runtime also? And that's huge, right? Because I think through the thousands of conversations I've had with practitioners and leaders, and usually one of the biggest headaches was, I could scan until the end of days, and I'm always going to find issues. The problem is I don't know what to focus on, right? What is actually in use, because that's a way to prioritize, and it impacts everything, not just typical infrastructure and operations, and as well as security, of course, right? Because of vulnerabilities, how do you prioritize remediation work? So massive impacts, right? That was always kind of a divide between what's happening in runtime and then what am I checking for in build and delivery. So this whole concept of in-use exposure is massive, right? That's kind of that connective tissue. It's going to tell you, like, these are the things you're seeing in early stages, but this is what's actually manifesting in runtime, right? And typically that's production, but you might also prioritize non-production environments. Maybe they are critical for you, or maybe they're exposed to some larger audience. So that was a really interesting one. In particular, the stat dropped to 15% of packages are actually in use. So if you start from kind of the 100%, these things have latent vulnerabilities, and then you start looking at, well, what's actually in use, that number drops down to 15%. And then particularly with vulnerabilities, if you want to look at things that are exploitable as well, right, there's known exploit code for it, that number drops down even more drastically to something like 2%. If you only have certain cycles, you might start focus on just that 2%. So it's having that information is incredibly valuable, not just to security teams, but also IT teams, right? Because if you're referencing libraries that aren't in use, you're going to want to pull them back, right? Because it's like dead code, right? It's operational burden, and it also ties into the concept of image bloat, right? You're using too much, right? And that's not a performant application, so you really want to kind of streamline things. So having that information is huge for both crowds. And then the other thing we saw was kind of on the cost side of things, and that was with like dollar cost specifically, but with Kubernetes cluster sizes. And I know not everybody's there in the world of Kubernetes, but for listeners, if they're newer to this, right, Kubernetes is kind of the de facto standard for running containers and kind of a enterprise scale or production capacity, spinning up and tearing down containers constantly, right? These are not long living things like you would expect with bare metal virtual machines. But what we saw was that as customers were operating larger Kubernetes clusters, right, and that translates to nodes specifically. Nodes are kind of one of those elements of a Kubernetes environment. If they were I believe it was over 1,000 nodes. They were wasting roughly $10 million on average. And it does slide down as well, right? Not everybody's running 1,000 node cluster that is very large. Some might opt to run less nodes that have more pods, right? So you have a lot more containers on less node machines. And still, though, the cost waste was roughly 40%. So there's it definitely moves exponentially, but there's cost savings to be had kind of across the board for kind of how Kubernetes clusters are spun up, which is huge, right? If you think about kind of the economic environment we're in, almost every organization is scrutinizing expense these days. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we've talked quite a bit about kind of around cost management, especially Kubernetes cost management. It's definitely something I think it sort of highlights. I feel like sort of where we are from a maturity perspective with containers, right? We've seen kind of the earliest adopters. Now we're starting to see that second wave a little more mainstream, and I think some of the things that you guys really highlighted in there are we're seeing some deficiencies, maybe some lack of using all the features, and that feels like pretty normal for a little more mainstream. They don't dive into the technology as much. Maybe they're not thinking as efficiently as they could have about a lot of things because they're just, they're sort of, oh, okay, we're getting this stuff running, but they don't have maybe all the expertise in-house that some of the earlier adopters or people who are paying attention to every feature might have had. I want to talk a little bit about some of the best practices, some of the best practice for managing vulnerability. There's some talk in the report about common vulnerability scoring system, CVSS. Not something I'm tremendously familiar with. Can you kind of give us a sense of what these scoring systems are doing and how they're helping to at least normalize for people what do some of these vulnerabilities mean? How can they best try to protect themselves from them or mitigate them and things like that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've got it a few times over the years. And I sometimes pepper it with the application security world too, because it's there's another kind of a taxonomy there with common weakness enumerations and a different scoring system, which is CWSS. But CVSS particularly aligns to CVE IDs, common vulnerabilities and exposures. Identities or identifiers, but really CVE IDs, how most people describe it. And that's kind of the catalog of everything we know, right? Known vulnerabilities in published software, sometimes hardware, right? If you think about embedded systems, and the creators of that, they're doing their own testing. Security researchers are doing external testing. They might find some bugs that exhibit conditions that if you were to abuse or exploit that, you create some really bad event like denial of service, or maybe you can escalate privileges, system compromise, right? There's a lot of different really negative outcomes, right? So that's the world of CVE IDs, and that's, that database is operated by MITRE, government organization. But as part of that, they also have the CVSS. There's been a couple versions of it. CVSS 3 is the current. And there are a lot of parameters within that you can use to kind of calculate relative risk scores for your organization. In my experience, most practitioners don't really fudge with that too much. They kind of take what the CVSS score is as essentially gospel, but there's some adjustments you can make based on like difficulty of attacking the particular piece of software or hardware. Like maybe it's really difficult to get access to some piece of code that's going to complicate the attack. That would generally lower the score. But you also have to look at things like, well, what's the potential impact, right? And then if you think of vulnerabilities like Log4Shell and the OpenSSL vulnerabilities that were potentially going to be big, and then they got scaled back a little bit, those had very high CVSS scores because they had potentially very broad impact to a lot of things. And, when you exploited it could result in privilege escalation and system compromise. So those are remote code execution. You hear terms like this. So all of those things kind of generally elevate the score, but there are some tunes and dials in there that, if you really wanted to dig into the weeds, you could adjust risk scores for your own organization based on how you build out your environments. But yeah, it's kind of just, you have that taxonomy, you have that rough scoring system, but what happens for organizations is they have vulnerabilities, yes, but then they also have misconfigurations or design weaknesses, and those things don't generally map to a CVE ID, right? It's something you've done,
Right.
It's not a known vulnerability, so you kind of end up with this mountain of all these problems, and then it's like, well, how do you prioritize operational challenges, but security as well, right? Like, how are you prioritizing risk? So that's another kind of thing that Sysdig does, is aggregates all this, right? Tells you what your problems are. The other thing we saw was kind of identity misconfigurations was another problem, right? Over permissioned users that aren't being used. That's a misconfiguration. That's not something that CVSS would help you with. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of shoot yourself in the foot.
Yeah. No, but it's good to know that there's, it's not just sort of, red and green. Do you have the CVEs? Are they new or they're old? It has become more of a combination of, the actual vulnerabilities, the operational, kind of context around it, configurations, best practices, and then there's some other stuff that has to go in there. So it feels like it gives you a more sort of 360-degree view of where you are and where you can get better. One of the things I was a little surprised about, because it's talked about a ton in our industry, especially in the security industry, is zero trust and what looked like sort of the lack of trust of zero trust in the industry. So I'm curious, we've seen sort of government mandates around zero trust. Obviously, a lot of stuff came out of some of the software supply chain hacks, the SolarWinds hack, and so forth. Are you surprised at, because I feel like as I get the chance to talk to a lot of companies, they're trying to implement zero trust. They recognize their perimeters have sort of gone away. They're not sort of the moats that they used to be. Are you surprised at people's opinions or takes on zero trust? And do you think there's something sort of deeper there, or is it just, they don't necessarily love the buzzwords of zero trust?
Oh yeah, that's a lot to unpack. So it's interesting, right? As a researcher, I got this question a lot, talking to Gartner clients, like in advisory work, right? Well, how does zero trust impact application security initiatives? And it often did feel like a buzzword, right? It is very loaded. A lot of vendors market to that. There is value in zero trust architecture concepts. Right? It's kind of an extension of things that security practitioners have been taught since the beginning. The fundamentals of restricting access and ensuring least privilege, right? Only grant the appropriate amount of access to do your job, right? That's kind of it, right? That's the basics of it. And zero trust is kind of an evolution of that, where it's, well, assume the environment is always compromised, right? So now you have to kind of layer in things like monitoring the endpoint and monitoring the cloud environment, right? And continuously authenticating and authorizing people, because something may have changed from the start of that interaction or session. So it's kind of a leap from, well, I've granted least privilege and I'm good. It's like, well, no, you can't kind of leave it at that, right? You have to assume something could go wrong at any given moment. So you have to be constantly or continuously checking these things. So that's a lot, right? If you think about that it's not just, I can't just set it and forget it. I can't just scan in a build pipeline. I need to be doing that. And then I also need to be monitoring the runtime to detect if something's going wrong. I need dynamic identity and access management systems doing dynamic challenges to users, right? Based on what's appropriate for the data they're trying to get to. So it very quickly rat holes into different technology topics. And, the other thing that is really important to remember when you think about authenticating and authorizing identities is that it's not just human users, right? We sometimes think of maybe somebody on their phone that's interacting with a mobile app that's going to talk to backend services. That's one kind of scenario, but, services themselves also need to authenticate and authorize, because they too can be compromised. You need to do all the same things you would expect with a human user. So we kind of took those for granted, I would say, when we were kind of operating in the world of data center environments and on premises, right? Like safe from the outside world. We firewalled everything. Yes, we know like service identities might be a problem or machine identity, but it's not a problem because we have our firewalls. And now when you start externalizing services, maybe from your data center, but certainly putting those types of workloads in clouds, right? Now these machine identities are existing in the cloud. They might be very short-lived. They might be highly automated. Typically, authentication and authorization needs to be fully seamless and transparent, right? You're not going to challenge a machine like you would a user. Like they're not going to plug in a 2FA code or answer a mobile authenticator challenge. So it just doesn't work, right? So you get a lot of different types of authorization scenarios that you have to account for. So that really muddies the water, right? And it's all part of the zero trust conversation. And sometimes what I've seen with, people, kind of all personas in organizations of all sizes is that zero trust, sometimes the mind tends to go, well, maybe just the human problem, but also to kind of back to the network perimeter style thinking. And, we do need to be concerned about network perimeters, but those perimeters look drastically different when you talk about cloud native architectures and moving things to cloud, right? It's public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud. So network perimeter is really difficult, right? You kind of talk about a shifting perimeter, and people will sometimes say identity is the new perimeter. And they're not necessarily wrong. It's all these things, right? And your network perimeter isn't kind of this fully defined thing at a network entry point. You have kind of perimeters within environments, like Kubernetes itself. A cluster is going to have its own network policies, right? Now you can restrict how containers and pods communicate with each other. So microsegmentation is generally how that's called out. But yeah, there's just a lot, right? This is all part of zero trust. And I feel like I've been talking on this for a few minutes, but it's like that is how complex it is. And it's great that we have a lot of recognition now on the problem, but it's incredibly deep, right? And most organizations aren't that mature that they can address all of that, right? That's a lot of manpower. You need a lot of tooling as well to support it. And there's just a lot that can go wrong when you think about the entire landscape of human identity and machine identity.
Right.
Hopefully that helps pick that apart. But yeah, it's definitely a wily beast.
Yeah, no, and I think you did a great job sort of explaining that it's, we start off with this sort of, one name, one concept in terms of zero trust, but the reality is, it impacts the sort of the technology landscape in a lot of ways, right? Like you said, it's whether you're talking about sort of human interaction, what we think of as like edge devices and edge VPNs and those types of, what we used to call that. Are we talking about machine to machine? Are we talking about other areas? And I think what we tend to find with that is, there may not necessarily be sort of an end point. People are they're working their way through, getting to, better overall security, but also just dealing with the adaptation of how things have changed and where people are, where machines are, whether you're in the cloud, you're on-prem, all that kind of stuff. Well, listen, I don't want us to give away everything that's in the report. You guys have done an awesome job with it. We've had a chance to dig through it, and it's been fun, kind of digging into it. If anybody wants to get a copy of it, they want to engage with you and your team. What are the best ways to go about doing that?
So for myself personally, I'm kind of like, I try to make myself as public as possible. Certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn, connect, ask questions. Right? It's I spent countless hours researching this, but also talking to people, and it's there's no dumb questions, right? It's only the questions that you don't ask, right? It's you have to kind of seek those answers, and it's a very long journey, right? A lot of these concepts don't even necessarily make sense until you're kind of dipping your toes in the water and really exploring all this technology and the impacts to that and everything, right? We talked about kind of ops issues, capital expenditure, security vulnerabilities and risk, right? There's a lot to it. So personally, reach out to me, but for Sysdig, the report is available on sysdig.com/usage report. And you certainly Google for it also, but yeah, quite a few avenues that people can obtain the report and certainly take a look and please do ask questions. It's kind of, as we were saying earlier, it's like this kind of continuous journey, how Sysdig looks at the data and is trying to help industry on what are those trends we're seeing? How can we help organizations in their security programs?
Yeah, no, outstanding stuff. Michael, thank you so much for helping us dig into Sysdig 2023 Cloud Native Security and Usage Report. There's also going to be a link in the show notes, folks. If you forget the URL, it's right there, in the show notes for you. Michael, thanks so much for educating us, for taking the time to dig into it, and most importantly, kind of sharing your expertise over a number of years of having worked on this and like you said, kind of being around the industry and really having a good view of what's going on. So, folks, with that, I want to thank Michael for his time. I want to thank Sysdig for their time today. We're going to wrap it up with that. Thanks to everybody who tells a friend, everybody who has been helping us grow the show, grow the community. Really appreciate it. And with that, we'll wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.